So since this is a small group, by all means, feel free to raise your hand to interrupt me. I really prefer informal presentations to formal presentations. And really, I'm just here to give you some basic information on human trafficking, what we're seeing here in Portland, and then later in the presentation, I'll talk about the intersections of human trafficking and the medical field. And again, that's not at all my specialty. I am a social worker. And that's part of why I really appreciate y'all coming out here. What we really need as service providers to survivors of human trafficking is to have advocates within the kind of frontline communities where human trafficking, where survivors of human trafficking are going to be identified, and have those folks really be able to look at it from their particular area of expertise, recognize it, take that information, and then roll with it, and provide that information to other folks within their area of expertise. Because me as a social worker, I'm not going to have the opportunity to go out to ER, doctors and say, here's what trafficking is, and here are things you can look for. But you as medical students, you as doctors, you as folks within the medical community definitely have that ability and that power, and that's incredibly important. And I'll get into that later in the presentation. So with that, my name's Chris, and I am the program coordinator for Catholic Charities OSSIP program. As Andy mentioned, it's an acronym that I can't stand. It stands for Outreach and Support to Special Immigrant Populations. And we're the only service provider here in the state of Oregon specifically designed to serve immigrant victims of human trafficking. The OSSIP program is one of the many programs that's operated by Catholic Charities. And we serve survivors of human trafficking from all backgrounds, all age groups, and really the only major qualifier is that they have to be an immigrant survivor of trafficking. There's a huge issue with U.S. citizen trafficking, and in all of my training, outreach, public awareness, I talk about all types of trafficking. It's an issue that I don't care to divide up as to where you're from or what type of trafficking you've experienced. I think that's ridiculous. But we're only allowed to serve immigrant survivors of trafficking. So when we see U.S. citizen survivors of trafficking, we refer them to another social service provider here in Portland that, that's really their expertise. And that, I'll get into their program later. They're the Sexual Assault Resource Center. They do a fantastic job working with U.S. citizen survivors, particularly child survivors of sex trafficking. So we're going to talk about human trafficking as a whole today. We're going to talk about this issue as it pertains to the state of Oregon and the types of trafficking that we're seeing right here locally in the state of Oregon. Just provide briefly some general information on human trafficking. There's a lot of kind of misconceptions about what this issue is, what the crime is, who's a victim of trafficking and who's not. And then we'll get into the medical information and the services that are available for victims. For those of you who just joined, by all means, feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, ask questions. I really prefer informal presentations, so thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. So what is human trafficking? We're going to talk about the laws very briefly. I work in an immigration law firm. The trafficking program is a sub-program of an immigration law firm. I am not an attorney, so I can just give you the basic information on the laws. If you have more questions afterwards, I can talk to you about them. If you have immigration-specific questions, I can refer you to one of our attorneys. In fact, our attorney reports directly to me, who provides immigration services to our clients. So we can always get you that information. We're going to talk about the process of human trafficking, trafficking and smuggling and the differences there, important definitions, and what trafficking is not. Again, looking at some of those misnomers. So the Trafficking Victim Protection Act is the primary law within the United States. It's a federal law that deals with the issue of human trafficking. It was originally authorized in 2000, reauthorized approximately every 3 years, most recently in 2008, and I just got an email today about discussions of what they'd like to be included in the new reauthorization that will be coming up. Really, the reauthorization, they just strengthen it every year. They keep adding in information pertaining to the types of victims that are being identified and what really needs to be done to continue to serve the population best. And the TVPA is the law that defines human trafficking under federal law. What that means for us as a service provider is that our victims have to meet these definitions in order to receive services through our human don't, we can refer them to other programs within Catholic Charities. We can refer them to other social service providers. We just can't use the federal money that's been granted to us to serve them directly. And really, in layman's terms, there is no difference between human trafficking and slavery. They are one and the same, and when victims come into our office, that's generally how they present, as survivors that have been enslaved over anywhere from a couple of weeks to the longest I've seen was up to 12 years that somebody was in a human trafficking situation. Legally, it's essentially coercion and deception, force and fraud for the purpose of placing men, women, or children in slavery or in slavery-like conditions. And we see forced labor, we see domestic servitude, debt bondage. We don't see child soldiering, but internationally, that's considered human trafficking, as is organ trafficking internationally. And specifically, the definition breaks down into two different areas. There's sex trafficking, which is essentially a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person who is induced to perform the act has not attained the age of 18 years old. And what's really important to note there is that if somebody is involved in commercial sex of any kind, and they are under the age of 18, legally in the United States, they're considered to be a victim of human trafficking. You cannot legally in the United States be a child prostitute. That's a term that gets thrown out in the media all the time. Child prostitution, which for one, criminalizes the child. The child's not committing a crime. The child's a victim of a crime. And for two, is it just a misnomer. It's something that doesn't exist. That child is a victim. The second half of the definition deals with labor trafficking. And that's essentially recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining of a person for labor or services in any sector through force, fraud, or coercion, and again, to subject them to involuntary servitude or debt bondage or peonage or some form of slavery. Generally, what we've seen here in Oregon is that the breakdown is U.S. citizen children end up being in a sex trafficking situation. And immigrant children and adults, usually young adults, are the folks who end up in labor trafficking situations. Part of that is just the population that we've seen. I think part of that as well is that in terms of what law enforcement is able to identify, it's a lot easier to identify child victims of sex trafficking than it is immigrant labor trafficking survivors. Child victims of sex trafficking are much more prominent on the internet. They're much more prominent when they're being sold in the traditional prostitution model, whereas labor trafficking is a lot harder to identify. Might be in a field, might be in the back of a restaurant, very, very challenging. So the basic elements, again, you've got a process, your recruitment, harboring, transporting, obtaining, or providing. Your means, force, fraud, and coercion. And your end, involuntary servitude, debt bondage, slavery, sex trade, any other form of forced servitude. And they kind of break down into these categories. Again, your adults, your children, and then the adults who might be victims of labor trafficking as well. Commercial Sex Act. The term Commercial Sex Act is actually fairly broad. When we think of Commercial Sex Act, we think almost immediately of prostitution. But Commercial Sex Act could also include exotic dancing and stripping. It could include pornography. It can include a number of different things. So again, when you're looking at that child under the age of 18 who's forced into a Commercial Sex Act, that's actually a pretty broad category. And trafficking versus smuggling, what we really want you to take away here is that smuggling can very easily become trafficking, but they are not really one and the same. The media uses the term interchangeably all the time. And smuggling is a transportation-based crime. I pay somebody $300, they transport me across a border, we go our separate ways. I've committed a crime against the United States by entering the United States illegally, but no crime has been committed against me. Whereas trafficking is an exploitation-based crime. And basically what you're looking at there is you might have paid somebody that $300, crossed the border, you get to where it is that you're going to, and that person says, well, actually you still owe me another grand, you have to pay off that grand in prostitution, or you have to pay off that grand working for me in this restaurant or working for me in this hotel, and if you don't, then X, Y, or Z things are going to happen to you or happen to your family. And again, the reason why this is important is because there's definitely a misunderstanding both within the media and within popular culture that human trafficking victims, if they're immigrants, should just be deported back to their home country. And in fact, they have not only human rights here in the United States, but they actually have rights as victims of the crime of human trafficking that specifically allow for them to stay in the United States, to have the trafficker prosecuted, to receive immigration benefits. I'll talk about those later. But there's definitely an issue of not only confusing the terms, but the fact that smuggling can very easily become trafficking. What human trafficking isn't? Well, for one, it's not synonymous with prostitution. Many women who are in prostitution may be victims of human trafficking, but not all women who are in prostitution are victims of human trafficking. Particularly in kind of the faith-based movement against trafficking, we've seen folks who really want to try and meld the two terms together. And first of all, legally that's incorrect. And second of all, it starts to kind of create a gray area where is the exploitation and how do we define exploitation, and are all women who are involved in trafficking or all women involved in prostitution being exploited? There's definitely an argument to be made for that, no question about it, but it doesn't fly as a legal argument. So there's a distinct difference there. Differs from just being undocumented here in the United States, as I mentioned before. It differs from other forms of labor or employment violations. So human trafficking actually supersedes other labor violations. Many trafficking victims have very legitimate claims to labor, the Department of Labor, both federal and state, where they can get back wages, they can file grievances, all of that. But trafficking actually supersedes that as well. And so they're eligible for many different benefits and services. And many crimes have been committed against the potential trafficking victim, but trafficking itself is a specific crime, specific definitions, and also trafficking victims may have been forced to commit crimes in the course of their human trafficking situation, and that's something that needs to be dealt with as well. Just to give you an idea of the different state crimes that we look at when we see trafficking charged, it's very, very rare to see human trafficking as a crime charged in the state of Oregon. In fact, the district attorneys never charge human trafficking. And the reason for that is that if it's a sex trafficking case, they will charge, what is it? Compelling prostitution and promoting prostitution. And specifically compelling prostitution, because compelling prostitution is a Measure 11 offense, which means there's a mandatory minimum sentence involved. And so they can get the guy on compelling prostitution and have him locked away, and they know they're going to get him locked away. Whereas with human trafficking, which is a crime in the state of Oregon, there's no mandatory minimum, so you might only be looking at getting the guy to go away for 6 months to a year. And often DAs will stack charges, and again, you'll notice most of these deal with sex trafficking. I've never seen a case of labor trafficking prosecuted successfully in Oregon, namely because the labor trafficking law within the state of Oregon is really fairly weak. It's not particularly strong, and I can't imagine somebody prosecuting that case successfully. Federal prosecutable crimes, sex trafficking, of course. The Mann Act is an ancient law from, the late 1800s, dealing with moving somebody for the purposes of prostitution across state lines, and it is still actually charged every now and again. But they looked at charging it on former governor of New York, Eliot Spitzer, and it got dropped. But it's still charged somewhat regularly. Coercion and enticement, transportation of minors for the purposes of prostitution, enticement into slavery, these various laws all could be charged under federal law on top